do my will. Go tell that long-tongued
God's Gonna Cut You Down, sung by Johnny Cash. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, Rand Paul, the Republican Senate nominee from Kentucky, is scrambling to tamp down a growing firestorm over comments he made suggesting he does not favor portions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Paul discussed his views on the civil rights legislation on Wednesday, the day after his Kentucky primary victory, in an interview on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He was questioned by host Robert Siegel.
You've said that business should have the right to refuse service to anyone, and that the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, was an overreach by the federal government. Would you say the same by extension of the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
What I've always said is that I'm opposed to institutional racism, and I would have, had I been alive at the time, I think, had the courage to march with Martin Luther King to overturn institutional racism, and I see no place in our society for institutional racism.
But are you saying that had you been around at the time, you would have hoped that you would have marched with Martin Luther King but voted with Barry Goldwater against the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Well, actually, I think it's confusing on a lot of cases with what actually was in the civil rights case, because, see, a lot of the things that actually were in the bill, I'm in favor of. I'm in favor of everything with regards to ending institutional racism. So I think there's a lot to be desired in the civil rights. And to tell you the truth, I haven't really read all through it because it was passed 40 years ago and hadn't been a real pressing issue in the campaign on whether we're going to vote for the Civil Rights Act.
But it's been one of the major developments in American history in the course of your lifetime. I mean, do you think the 64 Civil Rights Act, or the ADA for that matter, were just overreaches, and that business shouldn't be bothered by people with the basis in law to sue them for redress?
Right. I think a lot of things could be handled locally. For example, I think that we should try to do everything we can to allow for people with disabilities and handicaps. You know, we do it in our office with wheelchair ramps and things like that. I think if you have a two-story office and you hire someone who's handicapped, it might be reasonable to let them have an office on the first floor rather than the government saying you have to have a $100,000 elevator. And I think when you get to solutions like that, the more local the better, and the more common sense the decisions are rather than having a federal government make those decisions.
Rand Paul being questioned by Robert Siegel on NPR's All Things Considered on Wednesday. That evening, Paul appeared on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show. Host Rachel Maddow pressed him to clarify his views on the civil rights legislation. These are highlights from that interview.
There's 10 different titles, to the Civil Rights Act, and 9 out of 10 deal with public institutions, and I'm absolutely in favor of. 1 deals with private institutions, and had I been around, I would have tried to modify that. When you support 9 out of 10 things in a good piece of legislation, do you vote for it or against it? And I think sometimes those are difficult situations. I do defend and believe that the government should not be involved with institutional racism or discrimination or segregation in schools, busing, all of those things. But had I been there would have been some discussion over one of the titles of the civil rights. If we want to harbor in on private businesses and their policies, then you have to have the discussion about, do you want to abridge the First Amendment as well?
Should Woolworth lunch counters should have been allowed to stay segregated? Sir, just yes or no?
What I think would happen, what I'm saying is that I don't believe in any discrimination. I don't believe that any private property should discriminate either. And I wouldn't attend, wouldn't support, wouldn't go to. But what you have to answer when you answer this point of view, which is an abstract, obscure conversation from 1964 that you want to bring up, but if you want to answer it, you have to say then that you decide the rules for all restaurants, and then do you decide that you want to allow them to carry weapons into restaurants?
Rand Paul's comments ignited a firestorm of criticism and prompted him to issue a statement on Thursday saying he would not support an effort to repeal the Civil Rights Act. He said, quote, "I overwhelmingly agree with the intent of the legislation, which was to stop discrimination in the public sphere and halt the abhorrent practice of segregation and Jim Crow laws." Later that evening, appearing on CNN, he was questioned by Wolf Blitzer.
And I'll ask you a simple question. If you had been a member of the Senate or the House back in 1964, would you have voted yay or nay for the Civil Rights Act?
Yes, I would have voted yes.
So why is there all this confusion emerging right now? Give me your analysis, because you've had to issue a statement today. There have been interviews on NPR yesterday and MSNBC. Tell us what's going on.
Well, first of all, Wolf, I thought I was supposed to get a honeymoon. When does my honeymoon start, after my victory?
No such thing in politics, Dr. Paul.
No such thing. I think you're right. I think what troubles me is that the news cycle's gotten out of control. I mean, for several hours on a major news network yesterday, they reported repeatedly that I was for repealing the Civil Rights Act. That is not only not true, never been my position, but is an out-and-out lie, and they repeated it all day long. It started with my Democrat opponent asserting this, but has never been my position.
For more on Rand Paul's comments on the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, we're joined by two guests. Blair Kelly is an associate professor of history at North Carolina State University. She's author of Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts and African-American Citizenship in the Era of Plessy v. Ferguson. She's joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. And from Chicago, we're joined by Mike Irvin, a freelance journalist, longtime activist with the disability rights group ADAPT. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin in Raleigh with Professor Kelly. Explain your response to what Rand Paul is saying and the history of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
What concerns me is the notion that this legislation is meaningless in terms of our contemporary society, and that this history is something that we should forget about or move past, and that the notion of this hard separation between public and private actually makes sense in light of the lived experiences of African Americans at the time. To imagine a world where African Americans could just deal with public institutions and be excluded from private businesses that are open to the public, the white public, and yet cutting them out, was really profound. Imagine traveling as an African American during the Jim Crow era. You would not be able to stop for a restroom. You would not be able to find food to feed your kids. You might not be able to find lodging to stay overnight. And so many African Americans had to seek out black institutions to help them as they traveled. They'd have to go to their local black college in wherever they were on that journey and try and ask them for food and somewhere to stay. This is sort of central to their experience. So if we can imagine that American citizens didn't have the freedom to travel as they wanted to with dignity, respect, that they could not anticipate what kind of treatment they would get from place to place and day to day. Imagine raising children in that kind of context. Imagine trying to stay safe in that kind of context. So for me, for that history to be discounted as unimportant and not meaningful is really not a reflection of how horrible Jim Crow segregation actually was, and how much we have to remember it and guard against having any kind of extension of discrimination or any sense that a company serving the public should be able to choose what part of the public they want to serve.
And the battle over the 64 legislation, could you, especially for many viewers and listeners who maybe weren't alive at the time, talk about how intense was that battle? What was public opinion at the time with regard to the vote in Congress on this legislation?
Well, I mean, much of what Rand Paul is arguing, that there needs to be the separation, was the conservative line at the time. It's not dramatically different. In fact, his argument that private business owners should be able to determine whom they want to serve was the standard argument throughout the Jim Crow time period for excluding African Americans. We don't remember the degree to which segregationists at the time were actually quite couched in their language. They were worried about legal challenges, so they were trying to position themselves really strategically so that they could make an argument. And so what is eerie about Rand Paul's argument in the past days, I see he's walked back from it, is that it echoes an earlier time period in really distinct ways, and the divisions that were there in 1964. And I think we also don't recall the degree to which this was controversial. We'll remember that this is the reason why the March on Washington was called, to put pressure on D.C. to pass